There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that retrospectively become the frame through which you see everything that came after. They are the quiet hinges on which the heavy doors of your future swing open. For me, that moment was not a grand declaration or a dramatic turn of events. It was the sound of a cushion sighing under a familiar weight, the subtle shift of air in a small living room, and the almost imperceptible warmth that bloomed in the space between two people who had spent years mastering the art of keeping a safe and platonic distance. It was Julian, sitting down next to me on my worn-out sofa, his body angled towards mine, his expression a complicated map of something I could not yet read. He had said he wanted to talk about something important, and my mind had raced through a dozen disastrous scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. But then he sat, not opposite me, not at the other end of the couch, but close enough for the rough denim of his jeans to whisper against mine, close enough for our knees to touch. And in that simple, silent contact, every catastrophic possibility I had imagined evaporated, replaced by a single, terrifying, and profoundly beautiful one. The touch was nothing, and it was everything. It was a stray spark in a room filled with tinder, a single drop of rain on the surface of a still lake, promising a storm. My entire consciousness, which had been bracing for a confession of some life-altering problem, a job loss, a family crisis, a decision to move across the country, suddenly collapsed into that single point of contact. It was a focal point, like the precise plane of sharpness in one of my photographs, where everything else, the pattern on the rug, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant wail of a siren, blurred into an insignificant background. My skin, where his knee rested against mine, felt alive with a strange hum, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to travel up my leg, through my torso, and settle in my chest like a trapped bird. I held my breath, waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to give a name to the invisible thing that had just entered the room. But he remained silent, his gaze fixed on his own hands, which were clasped loosely between his thighs. The silence stretched, and within it, I felt a universe of unspoken words expanding. This was the precipice. I had lived on this precipice for years, carefully walking the edge, never looking down. And now, Julian had sat down beside me, his leg a quiet anchor, and for the first time, he was looking down into the canyon with me. Before that evening, our friendship was a carefully constructed piece of architecture, a house we had built together, beam by beam, over the better part of a decade. It was solid, reliable, a shelter from the world. We met in a black and white photography class our sophomore year of college, a prerequisite for me, an easy elective for him. I was the quiet observer in the corner of the darkroom, lost in the alchemy of developer and fixer, watching images ghost into existence on paper. He was the golden boy, the star swimmer with shoulders that seemed to strain the fabric of his t-shirts and a laugh that echoed off the tiled walls, a splash of vibrant color in my monochrome world. He was all kinetic energy, a whirlwind of easy confidence and casual charm, while I was stillness and shadow, more comfortable documenting life from behind a lens than participating in it. I never understood why he sought me out, why he chose the quietest person in the room to sit next to, but he did. He'd lean over my developing tray, his chin nearly on my shoulder, and marvel at the process with a genuine curiosity that disarmed me completely. He didn't seem to notice or care about my inherent awkwardness. He just saw something he found interesting and moved towards it with the same direct, uncomplicated power he used to propel himself through the water. Our friendship solidified in those quiet, chemical-scented hours. He learned the language of my world, aperture, shutter speed, depth of field, and I, in turn, began to understand his. I learned about the grueling pre-dawn practices, the punishing repetition of laps, the immense pressure condensed into the milliseconds of a race. I started going to his meets, my camera a shield that allowed me to be present without feeling exposed. I captured the tension in his shoulders on the starting block, the explosion of water as he dove, the perfect, streamlined arc of his body as it cut through the blue. Through my lens, I could study him in a way I never could face to face. I could appreciate the classical lines of his form, the determination etched into his features, the sheer grace of his power, without the terrifying vulnerability of direct observation. My photographs of him were honest, more honest than I could ever be in conversation. They were full of an admiration that bordered on reverence, a fascination that bled into a deep and deeply hidden affection. I told myself it was artistic appreciation, the photographer's eye for a compelling subject. For a long time, I almost believed it. The moment of truth, the point where I could no longer hide behind the camera or the guise of artistic interest, came during our senior year. It was the night after he'd lost the final race of the championships, a race everyone expected him to win, by less than 1/10 of a second. He hadn't spoken to anyone, had slipped away from the team and the commiserating crowds. I found him hours later, sitting alone on the empty bleachers overlooking the silent, moonlit pool. He didn't say a word when I sat down next to him, just stared at the water that had betrayed him. I didn't offer empty platitudes or forced encouragement. I just sat with him in the heavy silence, the smell of chlorine a ghostly reminder of his defeat. After what felt like an hour, he finally slumped sideways, his head coming to rest on my shoulder. It was an act of pure, unthinking exhaustion, a surrender. His body was heavy with fatigue and disappointment, and I became his anchor. I remember the rough texture of his jacket against my cheek, the faint, clean scent of his hair, the surprising weight of his trust. In that moment, my heart did something I had only ever read about. It ached. It was a physical, undeniable pang, a deep, resonant throb of pure, unadulterated love. It was terrifying. It was a revelation that threatened to burn down the comfortable house of our friendship. And so, I did what I had always done. I stayed perfectly still, buried the feeling under layers of practiced control, and simply held the weight of my best friend's world on my shoulder until he was ready to carry it again himself. After college, our lives diverged in practice, but not in spirit. Julian hung up his competitive goggles and channeled his relentless drive into a consulting job that sent him flying around the country. I pursued a quieter path, building a small freelance photography business, finding beauty in stillness, portraits, landscapes, the intimate architecture of people's homes. We lived in the same city, but in different orbits. His was a world of sharp suits, client dinners, and airport lounges. Mine was a world of soft light, quiet subjects, and the solitary peace of the editing room. Yet, the gravitational pull of our friendship remained constant. He was the one I called when a client was being impossible, and I was the one he'd text from a sterile hotel room in a city whose name he could barely remember, just to say he was lonely. He had a long-term girlfriend, Sarah, a kind and intelligent woman who seemed to understand the unique, unshakable foundation of our bond. I liked her genuinely. She made him happy, and his happiness was, I had convinced myself, all I truly wanted. I became a master of compartmentalization, building a fortress around my heart, a place where the truth of my feelings could live safely, without ever threatening the world outside. I was the supportive friend, the reliable constant, the quiet harbor where he could always anchor himself. It was a role I played with painstaking precision, a performance so convincing that even I sometimes forgot it was a performance at all. The first crack in that carefully constructed fortress appeared on a rainy Tuesday in October. The catalyst was, as it so often is, a heartbreak. But it wasn't mine. Julian showed up at my apartment just after midnight, drenched and hollowed out. He didn't have to say anything. The absence of his usual buoyant energy was a physical void in my doorway. He just stood there, dripping on my welcome mat, his face pale and his eyes looking like shattered glass. Sarah had ended it. It had been coming for a while, a slow erosion of connection he'd been trying to ignore, but the finality had broken him. I pulled him inside, wrapped him in the driest blanket I could find, and made him a cup of tea he didn't touch. He sat on my sofa, the one he was sitting on now, and talked for hours. He talked about the plans they'd made, the future they had sketched out, the comfortable rhythm of their life together that was now just a gaping silence. He wasn't just mourning the loss of a partner. He was mourning the loss of a map, a blueprint for the life he thought he was supposed to be living. I listened as I always did. I was his sounding board, his emotional ballast. But that night, something was different. The lines we had so carefully drawn around our friendship began to blur. As his words trailed off into exhausted silence, he didn't retreat to the other end of the couch. He simply listed sideways, much like he had on the bleachers all those years ago, and rested his head in my lap. My entire body went rigid. This was new territory. A head on the shoulder in a moment of public defeat was one thing. A head in the lap in the private intimacy of my living room was another entirely. It felt more vulnerable, more deliberate. I could feel the dampness of his hair through my jeans, the warmth of his scalp. I wanted to run my fingers through his hair, to offer the kind of tactile comfort his body was so clearly craving. But I didn't. I kept my hands resting on my own knees, my fingers clenched into tight fists. I was terrified that a single, gentle touch would betray the years of secrets I had kept, that it would be a confession I wasn't ready to make. So I sat there, a statue of feigned platonic comfort, while my heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner rattling the bars of its cage. He fell asleep like that, his breathing evening out into a soft, rhythmic whisper in the quiet room. And I stayed awake, long into the night, guarding his sleep and my secret with equal, exhausting vigilance. That night was the beginning of the ritual. It was unspoken, unacknowledged, but it became our new normal. In the weeks and months that followed, my apartment became his sanctuary from the echoing emptiness of his own. He would come over after work, exhausted from the performance of being fine, and we would fall into a comfortable pattern. We'd order food, put on a movie we would mostly ignore, and he would gravitate towards me on the couch. It started with him just leaning against my shoulder, then his arm would find its way around my waist, and eventually, it evolved into him stretched out, his head back in my lap, or curled up against my side, my arm a permanent fixture around his shoulders. We never spoke of it. It existed in a strange bubble of plausible deniability. He was grieving. He needed comfort. I was his best friend. It was just what friends did. Every logical part of my brain repeated this mantra, but the frantic, hopeful, terrified part of me knew it was something more. Each time it happened, it was a slow-motion agony of exquisite detail. I became a connoisseur of the subtle language of his body seeking comfort. I knew the exact weight of his head on my chest, the way his breathing would deepen when he finally let go of the day's tension. I learned the topography of his shoulders, the precise spot where my hand fit perfectly. I could feel the frantic energy of a stressful day bleed out of him, his muscles slowly unknotting under my steadying presence. I would sit for hours, my own body aching from the stillness, just to avoid disturbing him. I was a living piece of furniture, a human security blanket, and it was both the sweetest torture and the most profound joy I had ever known. My living room transformed from a simple space into a sacred one, the sofa and altar where I was allowed this temporary, conditional closeness. I was living in a state of suspended disbelief, floating in an ocean of ambiguity. I was terrified of the tide going out, of being left stranded on the shore, but for now, the water was warm, and it was holding me. I documented this period in my own way. I couldn't photograph him like this. It felt too sacred, too private, a violation of the unspoken trust between us. Instead, I photographed the aftermath. The indentation his head left on the couch cushion. The single coffee mug he used, left by the sink in the morning. The blanket he'd wrapped himself in, still holding the faint, ghost-like impression of his form. My photographs became a study in absence, in the lingering presence of someone who was both closer to me than ever and yet, in the most important ways, still impossibly far away. The images were quiet, melancholic, full of a yearning that was palpable even to me. They were pictures of a haunting, but a beautiful one. They were the evidence of a love that existed only in the spaces between words, in the warmth left behind on a cold leather cushion, in the silent language of two bodies finding solace in the dark. The tension, this delicate, shimmering bubble of unspoken things, grew with each passing week. The ritual became less about his grief and more about a mutual, unspoken need. There were moments when the platonic pretext wore so thin it was nearly transparent. His thumb would absent-mindedly trace circles on the back of my hand. He would shift in his sleep and his face would be inches from mine, his breath a warm puff against my lips. In those moments, the world would shrink to the space between us, and the urge to close that gap, to finally bridge that last, infinitesimal distance, was a physical force, a magnetic pull that took all my willpower to resist. I was a cartographer charting an undiscovered country, mapping every subtle shift in our dynamic, every new, unacknowledged intimacy. I was terrified of making a wrong move, of misinterpreting the signs and shattering the fragile peace we had found. So I waited. I observed. I held my breath and hoped that one day, he would be the one to finally give this new world a name. And that brought us to tonight, to this moment. He had been distant for a few days. The ritual paused without explanation. He'd been busy with a work project, he said in brief texts, but I could feel the shift, the pulling away. It was the tide I had been dreading. I had braced myself for the end of this strange, beautiful season. When he texted earlier, "Can I come over? Need to talk about something," my heart had plummeted. This was it. He was going to put a name to it, but it wasn't going to be the name I hoped for. He was going to apologize, to say things had gotten weird, that he needed space. He was going to rebuild the walls I had just started to believe were gone for good. I had spent the entire afternoon composing my face into a mask of serene understanding, preparing the words I would say to make it easy for him, to assure him that our friendship was unbreakable, that nothing had to change back if he didn't want it to. I was ready to absorb the blow, to retreat back into my role as the steadfast, platonic friend. But he didn't sit across from me. He didn't create a buffer of space for an awkward conversation. He sat next to me, a deliberate, undeniable act of proximity. His knee touched mine, and the contact was not accidental. It was a statement. I could feel it. It was the first word in a sentence he was still struggling to form. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was dense, charged with a high-voltage current of unspoken questions. I watched his throat as he swallowed, the slight bob of his atoms apple a sign of the nervousness he was trying to conceal. His gaze was still down, focused on his hands, as if they held the script he was supposed to be reading from. I waited, my own body a study in forced stillness, my breathing shallow, my senses on high alert. The bird in my chest was no longer just trapped. It was beating its wings against my ribs, desperate for release, for a clear sky. Finally, he took a breath, a long, shuddering inhale that seemed to draw in all the courage in the room. He turned his head slowly, and for the first time that night, his eyes met mine. His expression was stripped bare of all its usual defenses. There was no easy charm, no casual confidence. There was just raw, terrifying vulnerability. It was the same look I'd seen on his face on the bleachers years ago, but this time, it wasn't about defeat. It was about fear. Fear of a different kind of precipice. "Liam," he said, and my name was a fragile thing in the quiet room. "Julian," I replied, my own voice softer than I intended. He didn't say anything else for a long moment. He just looked at me, his eyes searching mine for something. An answer? Permission? I didn't know. I only knew that I couldn't look away, that this silent communion was the most honest conversation we had ever had. The fortress I had built around my heart, the one I had painstakingly maintained for nearly a decade, began to crumble. Not with a crash, but with the quiet surrender of stone turning to dust. I could feel the walls dissolving, leaving my long-hidden secret exposed in the soft light of my living room lamp. It was terrifying, and it was the most profound relief I had ever known. He broke the eye contact first, his gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before returning to my eyes. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible gesture, but it was a tectonic shift. It was a question asked without words, a question that made the air crackle. The space between us, once a carefully maintained buffer zone, was now a magnetic field, pulling us inexorably closer. I saw him take another shallow breath, steeling himself. He was going to speak. He was going to break the spell. Part of me wanted him to end this unbearable suspense. Another part of me wanted to live in this moment forever, this perfect, terrifying moment of pure potential, before a single word could change everything. The last few months, he began, his voice raspy, since Sarah. He trailed off, searching for the right word. You've been my anchor, I nodded, unable to form a reply. Anchor was a word I understood. It was a safe word, a friendship word. But the way he said it, the weight he gave it, felt different. I don't think I would have gotten through it without you, he continued, his eyes still locked on mine. But it's not just that, he paused, and the silence hummed. It hasn't been just that for a while now, my heart stuttered. This was it. The ground was shifting beneath me. I come over here, and I sit on this couch, he said, gesturing to the space around us. And for the first time all day, I can breathe. It's like the whole world goes quiet. And it's just us. In this room, his eyes were shining with an unshed emotion I couldn't decipher. And I started to realize I wasn't coming over because I was sad about Sarah anymore. I was coming over because I needed to be here. With you, every word was a careful step onto a frozen lake. He was testing the ice, and so was I. I listened, holding my breath, praying it would hold our weight. I don't know what this is, Liam, he said, and his voice cracked on my name. I don't have a map for this. All I know is that when I'm not here, I feel like I'm missing a part of myself. And when I am here, he shook his head slightly, a look of pure confusion and wonder on his face. When I'm here, it feels more like home than anywhere else I've ever been home. The word landed in the center of my chest and radiated warmth through my entire body. It was a word I had never dared to even think, a hope I had buried so deep I had forgotten it was there. And he had just spoken it into existence. He finally broke. The carefully constructed dam of his composure gave way, and a single tear traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just let it fall, a glistening admission of everything he couldn't say. And in that moment, all my fear, all my years of patient waiting and careful self-preservation dissolved into a powerful, overwhelming wave of love for this beautiful, broken, and impossibly brave man sitting next to me. Without thinking, I lifted my hand, the one that had been frozen at my side, and gently cupped his jaw. My thumb brushed away the tear track on his skin. The touch was electric. His skin was warm, a little rough with evening stubble. He leaned into my hand, his eyes fluttering closed for a second, a silent surrender. It was the first time I had ever initiated a touch like this, the first time I had crossed the line from passive comfort to active affection. It was a choice, and in that choice, I was finally telling my own truth. He opened his eyes, and they were full of a question that I had been waiting a lifetime to answer. The space between our faces was now negligible. I could feel the warmth of his breath, smell the faint scent of coffee, and something that was just uniquely, fundamentally Julian. The world had gone silent, just as he said. It was just us, in this room, on this couch, on the edge of everything. His lips parted slightly. Liam, he whispered a prayer, and I finally closed the distance. The kiss wasn't passionate or demanding. It was a question and an answer. It was tentative, soft, a gentle press of lips that spoke more than words ever could. It tasted of salt and coffee and a decade of unspoken yearning. It was a moment of impossible, breathtaking relief. It was the feeling of a photograph finally developing, the image emerging from the chemical bath, clear and true and more beautiful than I ever could have imagined. It was the feeling of coming home. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads rested against each other. Our knees were still touching. His hand came up to cover mine, which was still cradling his face. His fingers laced through mine, a perfect, easy fit. We stayed like that for a long time, just breathing in the new atmosphere of the room. The air itself felt different, rearranged. The old architecture of our friendship hadn't been destroyed. It had been renovated, a new wing added, a door unlocked that I never knew existed. Okay, he breathed out, a shaky laugh in his voice. So, that's what that was. I let out a laugh of my own, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. Yeah, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I guess it was, we didn't have the words yet. We didn't have a map, as he'd said. But for the first time, we were both standing at the same starting point, ready to draw one together. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or anxious. It was a comfortable, peaceful quiet, filled with the profound and simple truth of a shared feeling finally brought into the light. The bird in my chest was no longer frantic. It was calm, its wings folded, finally at rest. It had found its home. The morning after was a study in fragile beauty and profound awkwardness. I woke up on the couch, a crick in my neck, with Julian still asleep, his head on my chest, and his arm thrown possessively over my waist. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, striping the room in pale gold and shadow. For a few blissful, hazy moments, I just lay there, soaking in the impossible reality of it. The weight of him was real. The warmth of his body was real. The faint, sleepy scent of him was real. It wasn't a dream. I allowed myself the simple, forbidden pleasure of watching him sleep. The way his dark eyelashes rested against his skin, the slight parting of his lips, the slow, even rhythm of his breathing. It was a level of intimacy I had only ever allowed myself from behind a camera lens, and experiencing it directly, without any filter, was overwhelming. The quiet observer had somehow stumbled onto the stage, and the scene felt more real than anything he had ever just watched. But as the city outside began to wake up, so did a cold knot of anxiety in my stomach. What now? The kiss, the whispered confessions in the dark, had felt like a conclusion, the final chapter of a long book. But now, in the harsh, revealing light of day, I realized it was only the preface to a new one, a book with blank pages and no title. We had crossed a line, a monumental one, but we had no idea what the landscape looked like on the other side. My mind, so accustomed to analyzing every subtle gesture, went into overdrive. Was this a one-time catharsis for him, a product of loneliness and confusion, or was it the beginning of something real? The fear that I had misinterpreted a moment of desperate vulnerability as a declaration of love began to creep in, chilling the warmth of his body against mine. He stirred, a low groan rumbling in his chest, and his eyes fluttered open. For a second, they were unfocused, and then they landed on my face. A flicker of something unreadable passed through them. Surprise, then confusion, then a dawning awareness. He blinked, and the soft, vulnerable intimacy of the sleeping man was gone, replaced by the guarded expression of someone suddenly remembering where he was and what had happened. He pulled back almost instantly, untangling himself from me and sitting up, running a hand through his already messy hair. The sudden absence of his warmth was a physical shock. "Hey," he said, his voice rough with sleep. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was looking at the coffee table, at the floor, at the window, anywhere but at me. "Morning," I managed, my own voice betraying a nervousness I was trying to hide. I sat up too, the space between us on the couch suddenly feeling like a vast, empty chasm. The air, which had been so full of shared breath and quiet understanding just hours before, was now thick with unspoken questions and a brittle tension. I have that early meeting," he mumbled, already on his feet, searching for his shoes. It was a lie. I knew his schedule. His first meeting wasn't until 10. It was barely 7. "Julian," I started, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. "Are we okay? Did last night mean anything to you? Please don't run away." The words were all there, queued up, but they felt too heavy, too demanding for the fragile atmosphere of the morning. He found his shoes and shoved his feet into them without bothering with the laces. He grabbed his jacket from the back of a chair. He was a whirlwind of frantic, avoidant energy. "I'll call you later," he said, his hand already on the doorknob. He still hadn't really looked at me. He opened the door, and for a fleeting second, he paused, his back to me. I thought he might turn around, might say something, anything, to bridge the terrifying gap that had opened between us. But he didn't. He just stepped out into the hallway and pulled the door closed behind him, the soft click of the latch echoing in the silent apartment like a gunshot. I sat there, alone on the couch, for a very long time. The indentation where he had slept beside me was already starting to fade. The room felt cold, empty, haunted by the ghost of a possibility. The elation of the previous night curdled into a familiar, heavy ache of doubt. I had been so stupid. I had mistaken a moment of need for a moment of love. He had been adrift, and I was just a convenient harbor in a storm. Now the storm had passed, the sun was up, and he had set sail, leaving me behind on the shore. The quiet observer had allowed himself one moment of participation, and the result was this: a hollow silence, an unmade couch, and the bitter taste of hope turning to ash in my mouth. My carefully constructed world, which had felt so gloriously, terrifyingly expanded the night before, had just snapped back to its original dimensions. Only now the walls felt tighter, the air thinner, the loneliness more acute than ever before. The week that followed was one of the longest of my life. It was a masterclass in a specific kind of modern torture, the kind conducted through the silence of a smartphone. My phone became a talisman of my anxiety, a small, black mirror reflecting my worst fears. I would stare at his name in my contacts list, my thumb hovering over the call button, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. I reread our last text exchange from before he came over, searching for clues I might have missed. I analyzed the punctuation. I obsessed over the timing of his replies. It was madness. He had said he would call, but he didn't. The silence from his end was absolute, a digital wall he had erected between us. On the third day, I broke. I sent a casual, breezy text, a masterpiece of feigned nonchalance. "Hey, just wanted to see how that meeting went the other day. Hope all's well." I hated myself for it. It was a test, a pathetic little probe sent out into the vast emptiness, and the lack of an immediate reply was its own agonizing answer. Hours later, a reply finally came. A single, sterile sentence. "Hey, meeting was fine. Swamped with work this week. Talk soon, talk soon." It was the polite, meaningless brush-off of a stranger, not the language of a man who had called my apartment home just a few nights ago. It was a door being quietly, but firmly, closed in my face. My work suffered. I went into my darkroom, the place that had always been my sanctuary, but I found no peace there. The familiar scent of chemicals felt cloying, the red safe light oppressive. I tried to edit the photos from a recent portrait session, but I couldn't focus. The faces on the screen were just strangers. The only face I could see was Julian's, his expression in that last moment before he kissed me. So open, so vulnerable, so full of a promise that now felt like a cruel joke. I found myself developing blank sheets of paper, just watching the white turn to black, a perfect metaphor for my hope. The process of creation, of bringing an image into the light, felt impossible when my own inner world had been plunged into such a profound and disorienting darkness. I felt like a photograph that had been brutally overexposed, all the nuance and detail bleached out, leaving only a stark, painful whiteness. By the end of the week, I had moved from anxiety and hurt to a slow-burning anger. It wasn't just about my own feelings anymore. It was about the disrespect. It was about the cowardice. He had opened a door, invited me in, and then slammed it shut, leaving me stranded in the hallway. He had taken my trust, my vulnerability, my decade of carefully guarded affection, and treated it like it was nothing, a momentary lapse in judgment to be ignored and forgotten. Our friendship, the foundation upon which everything had been built, deserved more than a dismissive text and a week of suffocating silence. The quiet observer, the patient friend, had reached his limit. I couldn't live in this ambiguity, this painful limbo. I needed an answer, even if it was the one I dreaded most. I needed to hear it from him, face to face. I needed him to look me in the eye and tell me what last night had been and what we were now. I drove to his apartment on Saturday afternoon. I didn't call or text ahead. I knew if I gave him the chance, he would make an excuse. Every traffic light felt like a test of my resolve. Every mile a journey deeper into a confrontation I was terrified of, but knew I had to have. When I stood outside his apartment door, my heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. My hand trembled as I raised it to knock. This was it. There was no going back from this. I was no longer waiting for him to give our story a name. I was demanding one. He opened the door, and the surprise on his face was genuine. He was wearing sweatpants and an old university sweatshirt, his hair a mess. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed with something that looked like guilt. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping any better than I had. "Liam," he said, his voice quiet. "What are you doing here? You said we needed to talk." I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "You were right. We do." He didn't invite me in right away. He just stood there in the doorway, blocking the entrance, a physical barrier between us. For a moment, I thought he was going to close the door to send me away. But then he seemed to deflate, the tension going out of his shoulders in a long, weary sigh. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said. His apartment was neat, sterile, the model of an organized professional, but it felt unlived in. There was a profound loneliness to the space, a lack of personal warmth that stood in stark contrast to the comfortable, cluttered chaos of my own place. We stood awkwardly in his living room, a room I had been in countless times before, but which now felt like foreign territory. The silence stretched, and I knew that this time, I had to be the one to break it. I couldn't wait for him to find the words. "What happened, Julian?" I asked, my voice devoid of accusation, just a simple, raw question. "Last weekend. And then this week. What happened?" He wouldn't look at me. He walked over to the large window that overlooked the city, staring out at the traffic below. "I don't know," he said, his back to me. "That's not good enough," I said, a new firmness in my tone. "That's not good enough for me, and it's not good enough for us. For our friendship. You don't get to kiss me like that. You don't get to say the things you said, and then just disappear. I deserve more than that." He flinched at my words, a slight tightening in his shoulders. He turned around slowly, and his face was a mask of conflict. He looked lost. "You're right," he whispered. "You're right. I'm sorry. I've been a coward. Why?" I pressed, taking a step closer. "Just tell me why. If it was a mistake, just say it. If you regret it, just tell me. I can take it. I can. But this silence. This is what I can't take." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were swimming with a desperate confusion. "Because it didn't feel like a mistake," he said, his voice cracking. "That's the problem. It felt like the most real thing that's happened to me in years. It felt right. And that scares the hell out of me." Liam, the confession hung in the air between us, raw and honest. All my anger dissipated, replaced by a wave of empathy. He wasn't running away from me. He was running away from himself. "I've spent my whole life on a track, you know," he continued, his voice getting stronger as the words started to flow. "Swim in this lane, get these grades, take this job, date this girl. It was all laid out. A map, like I said. And then, you were never on the map. You were just my best friend, my constant, the one solid thing in my life that I never had to question." He paced the room, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of pure frustration. "And then Sarah and I ended, and the map was gone, and I was lost. I started coming to your place, and it was the only place I felt safe. And somewhere along the way, the lines got blurry. I started needing you in a way I've never needed anyone. Not just as a friend. It was something more. And I kept telling myself it was just the grief, that I was just lonely. But that night, when I kissed you, it wasn't about being lonely. It was about you." He stopped pacing and stood in front of me, his eyes pleading for understanding. I've never felt that way about a guy before, Liam. I don't know what it means. I don't know who I am if that's a part of me." I woke up the next morning, and I panicked. All I could think was that I had broken the one thing in my life I couldn't bear to lose. Our friendship. So I ran. I thought if I could just put some distance between us, I could put things back in the box. I could pretend it never happened, but you can't, can you? I said softly. He shook his head, a single, decisive movement. "No," he said. "I can't. This whole week has been hell. Every time my phone buzzed, I was terrified it was you, and I was terrified it wasn't. The only thing worse than the thought of talking to you was the thought of not talking to you." He closed the small distance between us, and for the first time, he looked at me with a clear, unwavering gaze. The confusion was still there, but underneath it was a bedrock of certainty. "I don't have the answers, Liam," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I don't know what this looks like, or where we go from here. I'm scared, but I know one thing for sure. I don't want to lose you. And I don't want to go back to pretending that you're just my friend." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before it gently rested on my arm. His touch was tentative, a question. It wasn't the desperate, comfort-seeking touch of the past few months. It was something new. It was intentional. I covered his hand with my own, my fingers curling around his. I gave his arm a gentle squeeze, a silent answer. "Okay," I said. "Then let's be scared together." A small, watery smile touched his lips. It was the first genuine smile I had seen from him in a week, and it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. The tension in the room didn't vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer the brittle tension of avoidance and fear, but the humming, vibrant tension of a new beginning, a shared vulnerability. We weren't on solid ground yet, but we were no longer on opposite sides of a chasm. We were standing on the edge together, hands linked, ready to figure out the next step. It wasn't a perfect resolution, not a neat and tidy ending. It was something better. It was a real, honest, and terrifyingly hopeful start. The days that followed our confrontation were not a seamless transition into a perfect romance. They were quiet, tentative, and filled with the careful, deliberate work of building something new. We didn't fall into bed. We fell into conversation. We spent hours talking, really talking, in a way we never had before. We dismantled the old architecture of our friendship, examining every beam and joint, deciding what to keep, what to discard, and what to reinforce. Julian talked about his confusion, his ingrained expectations for his life, and the surprising, liberating terror of realizing that the future he had always planned might not be the one he actually wanted. I, in turn, finally spoke of the long years of hidden affection, of the quiet ache of loving him from a distance, of the fear of risking our priceless friendship for a love I never thought could be returned. It was like developing a delicate photograph. We had to be patient, moving slowly, allowing the truth to emerge in its own time. If we rushed it, if we exposed it to too much light, too much pressure, too soon, we risked destroying it completely. So we took it one day at a time. We went for long walks, our hands brushing against each other, until eventually, one of us was brave enough to let our fingers intertwine. We cooked dinner together in my small kitchen, a comfortable, domestic dance of chopping vegetables and stirring sauces, the easy rhythm of balm to the lingering awkwardness. We were learning a new language, a new way of being with each other, where every small gesture was a word, and every shared silence was a sentence. The couch ritual returned, but it was fundamentally transformed. It was no longer a refuge built on a foundation of plausible deniability. It was a conscious choice. When he came over now, he would look at me, a soft question in his eyes, and I would open my arm, an invitation. When he settled against me, it wasn't with the heavy weariness of a man seeking unconscious comfort, but with the gentle intention of a man choosing to be close. There was no pretext of watching a movie, no pretense of exhaustion. We were simply there, together, finding solace and strength in the quiet, deliberate act of holding each other. The anxiety that had once buzzed beneath the surface of my skin during those moments was gone, replaced by a profound and steady sense of peace. This was real. This was ours. About a week after our talk, we found ourselves on the couch, the lights low, the city humming outside my window. He was quiet, tracing patterns on my arm with his finger. I could feel the weight of unspoken words in the air, but this time, it wasn't a heavy, anxious weight. It was the gentle gravity of an approaching intimacy. "Can I ask you something?" he said softly, his voice a low rumble against my chest. "Always," I replied. He shifted, propping himself up on one elbow so he could look at me properly. His face was close, his expression serious and tender. "That night," he started, "when I kissed you, what did you feel?" I thought for a moment, wanting to give him an honest answer, one that went beyond the simple truth of my happiness. "Relief," I said finally. It felt like I had been holding my breath for 10 years, and I could finally exhale. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile of pure, unadulterated understanding. "Yeah," he breathed. "Me too. I think I had been too, and I didn't even know it." He leaned in then, and the kiss that followed was nothing like the first. The first had been a question, a desperate breaking of attention. This was a statement. It was slow and deep and sure. It was a kiss of knowing, of acceptance, of a shared future. It was the feeling of two separate worlds finally, beautifully, colliding and creating a new one. It was no longer about a precipice. It was about the solid ground we were building, right here, together. Slowly, carefully, a new normal began to crystallize. It was a mosaic of small moments, quiet intimacies that felt more significant than any grand gesture. It was him leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom without asking. It was me learning exactly how he liked his coffee in the morning. It was him bringing over a box of my favorite photo paper because he'd seen it was running low. It was the way he started saying "we" when talking about future plans, the words sounding so natural on his lips that it brought a lump to my throat. His apartment, once a symbol of his lonely, compartmentalized life, slowly became just a place he kept his suits. My apartment, my quiet sanctuary, became our home. One evening, I came out of my darkroom to find him asleep on my bed, not the couch. He was stretched out diagonally, one of my photography textbooks open on his chest, the late afternoon sun painting a warm stripe of light across his sleeping form. The door to my bedroom, a space that had always felt so intensely private, so solely mine, was wide open. He hadn't asked. He had just known he was welcome. He had known he belonged. I stood in the doorway for a long time, just watching him, my camera sitting forgotten on my desk. I didn't need to capture this moment. I wasn't the observer anymore. I was a part of it. The image was already perfectly developed, imprinted not on film, but on my heart. That night, for the first time, I closed the bedroom door. Not to shut him out, but to shut the rest of the world out. We lay in the dark, our bodies curled together, a comfortable arrangement of limbs. The silence wasn't a void to be filled but a space to be shared, a warm, safe blanket. I thought back to that first moment, the touch of our knees on the sofa, the spark that had ignited this slow, beautiful burn. It seemed like a lifetime ago. We had navigated the fear, the confusion, the painful aftermath, and we had found our way here, to this quiet, simple, and profound peace. I realized then that a home isn't just a place with four walls and a roof. It's a feeling of being seen, of being known, of being safe enough to be your most vulnerable self. It's the quiet understanding that passes between two people in the dark. Julian, in his search for a map, had been looking for a destination. But we had found something better. We had found a direction. And that direction was simply, and finally, toward each other. We began to heal, not just from his heartbreak, but from the years of our own unspoken loneliness. In the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned how to create together.